on the church's approach to immigration. Do we wonder why, with all the other issues of concern, the church places such a focus on this question of immigration and justice for immigrants? And why have the U.S. bishops, including our bishops, referred to this as an issue of life and dignity for the human person? And why is that important for us as a church? And so these are just some of the questions that are in front of us. And I want to read to us, as part of the context, an article that Bishop Van wrote recently, back in August, after a particularly difficult week for the immigrant community. And I'm just going to read a couple, not the entire things, but a couple sections from it. He says, "We are hurting. The public charge regulation being finalized this week is just the latest attack against immigrant families by the current administration. Despite overwhelming opposition, the administration has chosen to advance a regulation that directly harms families and communities and threatens a core principle of the American immigration system, family unity. The public charge regulation reinforces a preferential option for the wealthy rather than for the poor, as we find in the Catholic faith, and exacerbates fears already felt by immigrant communities. It cuts to the heart of the most basic realities for immigrant families and calls into question a more than 100-year-old recognition that health care and food are basic to the ways families provide for loved ones, remain productive, and help communities thrive. As Pope Francis reminds us, echoing his predecessors, the Catholic Church expects the basic human rights that St. John the 23rd summed up in his encyclical Pacem in Terris to apply to migrants as well. The right to live and to the means necessary for the proper development of life, particularly food, clothing, shelter, medical care, rest, and finally, the necessary services. As St. John Paul II emphasized, that the right not to emigrate or to live in peace and dignity in one's own country is as fundamental as the right to emigrate. And this echoes John the 23rd's encyclical as well. And he, a little further on down, he mentions that after this same week was the week where we had this a shooting in El Paso. Just 4 days later, as the nation reeled from the tragedies in El Paso and Gilroy and Dayton, the administration green-lighted the largest immigration raid in a decade at several food processing plants in Mississippi. Nearly 700 workers were arrested. Many children returned from school to empty homes after their parents were hauled away from their jobs and families, their futures uncertain." And he goes on in there as well. I would commend the article to you, and it's a strongly worded letter. And one of the issues that came up with some of our parish leaders, and we talked about this at a couple of our meetings. I work in the Office of Life, Justice, and Peace. My name is Greg Walgenbach. And is this question from 1 week to the next, there was a parish in Mississippi that had several scores of people, I think it was a couple hundred, who were just gone from 1 week to the next. And it was it wasn't one of our mega parishes here in Southern California, but it was a smaller parish. But a couple hundred people, including ushers and lectors and others who worked there. And the question was for us here and for folks all over the country is what happens to us in our communities when from 1 week to the next, a brother or a sister is missing? What happens for us in our own parishes when, not if, but when, one of our brothers or sisters or their family member is picked up and is detained? The families maybe need support. Are we ready to respond? Do we know how we would respond? And these are some of the questions that we are asking ourselves as parishes and trying to prepare for. But also, we really want to have room to understand what is going on. Because I want to say at the outset of this time tonight, this crisis in our community around immigration and border issues and legal issues around immigration is not a new phenomenon. And we're currently addressing the reality right now under this administration, but we've dealt with injustices under the previous administration before that, and the administration before that, and the administration before that. And so it's not to say that somehow that this is a new problem, but what we did want to address and what has come up in the past year are some unique ways that we face some very difficult and increased challenges in the current environment. And so we've had a lot of people contact the diocese or ask me or ask our office or maybe ask you at the parish, well, what is it that's happening that's so bad? How is it that much worse? Wasn't it bad before? And the short answer is yes, it was bad before. But yes, it is also getting worse, and there are some realities that are becoming more difficult. And so really tonight we're here to break that open a little bit more and understand what it is that's happening, what it is about the laws, the rule of law, the policy enforcement that is changing, and to address that a bit. But as we start off, we're going to start with a word of prayer and then a moment to share together. And I want to invite just a moment of quiet as we begin our time together tonight. And we pray in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Holy God, we thank you for this time to be together on this windy evening here in Garden Grove. And we thank you for everyone present tonight, and we ask for your Spirit to be present, working in our midst. We thank you, Jesus, that you are here with us. We pray that you would both enliven our conversation, give us wisdom, give us compassion and kindness and respect for one another as we speak and share. And we pray that you would help us to know how to respond as your disciples, as your children, Lord God, and to care for those around us, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with you. And we pray that you would give us a good evening tonight. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I want to begin very quickly. We do this at a lot of our meetings, so some of you may have already done this, but if you haven't, I invite you into this exercise. We're just going to take a couple minutes, and I'm going to ask you to turn to a neighbor. Maybe it's somebody you came with, but if you know them really well, maybe not, but that's fine. And just take a minute, a couple minutes each, to share with your neighbors something that you know about your own family migration history. So you might have migrated here yourself, or your parents, or maybe many generations back, but what is it that you know about your family migration story? Something that what you feel comfortable sharing. Share that with your neighbor. Maybe it was the country of origin your ancestors came from. Maybe the first job they had when they got here, if you know that. Or what some of it was like. How did they end up here in the United States, in Southern California, even Orange County? So if you could take a minute or two. And so I want to do it in order here so you know. And they'll remind you as we go. Doug Ryan is the Regional Development Director for Catholic Relief Services, CRS West. And he's the former country representative for Honduras with CRS and was assistant country rep for Guatemala, as well as, was it Peace Corps, in Costa Rica. So he spent a lot of time in Latin America and Central America working there, as well as working with the organization here. And in particular, he's going to, a little bit later, address the question of root causes, which is always a big question that comes up and something that as a church we're also very attentive to. Next to him is Jennifer Coe, who is visiting professor of law at UC Irvine School of, UC Irvine, excuse me, I went there, I should know how to say the name of the school, UC Irvine School of Law, and also the president of the board of directors of the Orange County Justice Fund. And she'll tell you more about that. Next to her is Lisa Ramirez. And Lisa is a California State Bar Immigration and Nationality Law Specialist and founding partner of the U.S. Immigration Law Group. And she's worked in a variety of sectors, including previously in Catholic Charities and at Public Law Center and in other places, and specializes in family-based immigration through petitions and waivers, naturalization. Has also been a big help, I know, to Bishop Van and to the diocese in several cases involving religious workers and priests from other countries, and working on those cases as well. Next to her is Diana Gulo, and she is the Director of Immigration Services at Catholic Charities of Orange County. She's a native of Orange County and a licensed clinical social worker, and also has a master's in international relations. And next to her is Anna Gallagher. And Anna, we're very grateful to have her here. She is the Executive Director of the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, Incorporated, also known as Clinic. Bishop Van, our bishop here in Orange, is currently the board chair of Clinic as for the bishops on the board. And he's completing his second 3-year term and is going to be moving off of that board. But they have spent a lot of time together, and Bishop Van has been a great champion and advocate for the work of Clinic and really the work of all these folks and organizations. And so I think could we just thank our panelists all together here and welcome them? And we're going to start with Anna, and then move through as we go along. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg, for that beautiful welcome, and thank you so much, Alma, for your really moving talk. And I think it's important to remind all of us, and again, especially us on the panel, that there's a face behind the number, especially in such busy times when we have so many cases, so many worries, so many distresses, to stop and think of the face and the life, mother, father, son, daughter, aunt, uncle, behind the number. So thank you very much for starting us. So my name is Anna Gallagher. I'm the Executive Director of Clinic. I'm very happy to be here. I am the daughter of immigrants from the west of Ireland. I'm married to an immigrant. Our older son is adopted. He's an immigrant. Our youngest son, biological, lives in Spain. So I grew up in a mixed family with lots of stories and separations and happiness and sadness and exile. So I'm here to talk a little bit about, I want to explain the work that we do as Clinic and then focus on the situation at the border, specifically our project in Juarez. Clinic is an affiliate organization. So we have almost 400 affiliate members across the United States. The affiliates provide immigration legal services to low-income immigrants. And I like to say we are the largest low-income law firm for immigration services in the country. We have a national footprint, and we have affiliates up at the table, right? and attorneys we've trained. So we're very pleased to be here with them. And so what we do, folks, is we do A to Z. So if an organization comes to us, and they want to start an immigration legal services program, we help them build that program, create it, we capacity build, we train them, we have attorneys on call, we advocate before the administrative agencies when the processes aren't working, and we're quite busy now. We also do religious immigration services, so we assist parishes, organizations to bring religious brothers and sisters over from other countries. I know I'm missing something. I always miss something. We do quite a bit, and I generally stay out of the way because my people are so good. So I wanted to just share with you a little bit the faces behind the numbers at the border. In August, due to the growing need in Juarez, our bishops asked us to set up an operation there to provide legal services to the migrants that are waiting in Mexico. And as many of you may know, this year, the administration issued proclamations and orders saying that people arriving at our southern border who are seeking asylum have to wait in Mexico while their process takes place in the United States. So there are 15,000 asylum seekers now in Juarez. Primarily people from Central America and Mexico, but also from other countries, including Cuba, Venezuela. So what happens is they come to the southern border. When they come to the southern border, they come to Juarez. If they are afraid to go back home, they come to the port of entry and they ask for asylum. Oftentimes, they always have to wait. So they're either given a notice to go to court several months later, or they're told to put their name on a list, and it takes several months before they will be able to return and present their claim and explain why they were afraid to go home. That is all of the non-Mexicans. There are 3,000 Mexicans now in Juarez who are located at the mouths of 3 bridges and sleeping on the streets. and this is a relatively new phenomenon. I'd say this is within the last 2 to 3 months. They're sleeping on the streets because there is no standard procedure for them to seek asylum, meaning the other two groups will either receive a hearing notice or their names on a list and their numbers are called at some point in time. There is no standard procedure for the Mexicans. They go to the bridge, they ask if they can cross, and most of the time they're told, no, we can't accept you, there's no room. So there are 3,000 Mexicans and 12,000 non-Mexicans in Juarez waiting for asylum. So I just wanted to tell you just a few stories about the people I saw so you'll understand the faces. There was one young woman, 25 years old, fleeing domestic violence from Guatemala with her 5-year-old daughter, waiting to come to the United States to file for asylum. Within a week, her ex-partner called her regularly to say he knew where she was and he was coming for her. Second, she was robbed of her money after she started a small job and was paid for some work at the end of the week. Third, when she was in the street in broad daylight, someone tried to steal her 5-year-old daughter from her, holding her hand. Our administration says that people can safely stay in Mexico while they wait for their asylum claim. Our administration is wrong. Other individuals I met, especially when I did a Know Your Rights presentation in the street at the foot of the Santa Fe Bridge in Juarez, I met a family of husband, wife, brother of the wife, 2 nephews of the wife, who had quickly left their home in Cuernavaca and were obviously people, working people, but people that did not want to leave their home. But the gangs had stewarded them and told them if they came back and they didn't get their money, they would kill them. That was the second family. A third family was a husband and wife and 2 small children from Mexico. The wife's father was murdered. The gangs surrounded their house and they were able to escape. Every single person I spoke with, and I spoke with many, had a story of violence and terror. And they are waiting at the border. I'd like to finish just by saying that the United States has an international and according to our own laws, an obligation to admit asylum seekers when they come to the United States. We can do this, folks. We can do this. We're one of the richest countries in the world. We had a procedure that worked before. There's large numbers. There is a strain on the system. But when people come to our country, to the borders and seek asylum, there's a procedure to admit them, to process, and to set scheduled hearings. The greatest guarantee that someone will show up for hearings if you provide them legal counsel. And there are thousands of attorneys and accredited reps in the United States standing ready to represent these people. This administration is wrong and they're violating the law by not permitting these people to come to the United States. These people are not safe in Mexico. And they're fleeing persecution. So thank you. I think I'll stop there and pass it to the next person.
Thank you. I too just want to acknowledge Alma, and I think one thing that she shared, and I think kind of hit the nail on the head, is although I don't pretend to be impacted in quite the same way, but I think we are all living in very uncertain times. The DACA students, those that are not DACA students, this freshman class entering college right now is basically the first group of students that were pre-DACA, meaning that when this administration terminated the DACA program, they're no longer accepting initial applications. We're pretty much back where we started before DACA even existed. So they're undocumented students. I think the terminology has now been created, undocumented students. And so there's a lot of people, a lot of immigrants that are certainly feeling this uncertainty. I think lawyers, practitioners, legal service providers were really feeling a lot of uncertainty, I think, on a daily basis. And although, like Greg mentioned, there's always been challenges around immigration law, we are very much in unprecedented times. And it's not so much because the laws have changed. It's really the interpretation of those laws. It's the how those laws are being enforced that I feel has really distinguished this administration. in Bishop Van's letter that Greg had read, you know, he talked about specifically this public charge rule, which I'm going to share with you a little bit about, so perhaps you can understand it a little bit better. But it's very much a preferential option for the rich. The impact that this rule or the interpretation, right, of an existing law, the public charge rule or inadmissibility ground has existed for many years. That in itself is not new. What's new is the interpretation of the application of that rule and the factors that have now been put into place by policy. So again, it doesn't require an act of Congress, but certainly those policies are carried down throughout all of our USCIS offices, the adjudicators that are tasked with processing these applications. So the public charge rule will significantly and negatively impact hundreds and thousands of potential immigrants who otherwise would be able to immigrate into the United States. The rule was set to go into effect on October 15th, which was a Tuesday. That Monday was a holiday. Everybody was kind of on pins and needles waiting to see if one of the federal lawsuits that were filed was going to stop that rule from going into effect. We, at our office, were in a slurry of trying to get every application we possibly could. We were in there on Saturday getting applications filed because we knew if we did not get it filed before the rule went into effect, our clients would essentially lose the opportunity. The factors that the government is considering is age. So they're looking at if you're under 18 or over 61, they basically consider you're not of working age. So the presumption is you may be dependent on government benefits. They're going to look at whether or not you're fluent in English, you reading, writing, or understanding English. They're looking at your health history, medical condition. Do you have any medical condition that requires ongoing treatment? It's going to be deemed a negative factor because if you cannot overcome that presumption by having private health insurance, then they're going to assume that you too will be a public charge. And what it means to be a public charge is, it is when the government suspects that someone, an immigrant, is going to be dependent primarily on government benefits. Now, the government already has, as it did in the asylum process as well, procedures in place to kind of ensure those protections. There's something that's called an affidavit of support, where the petitioner or the sponsor asking the individual to immigrate to the United States would assume that financial responsibility. It's a contract that they signed with the government. Should that person utilize any type of public benefits, the government has the right to seek reimbursement for those benefits from the petitioner or the sponsor. So the significant change that's happened under this public charge rule is that the burden has shifted from looking at the income and assets of the petitioner or the sponsor, and now looking at the applicant, the beneficiary, the immigrant that's trying to enter the United States. So on a practical level, who has that impacted and what we've seen? One, we had a lot of US citizens that wanted to petition their elderly parents. You know, when parents are living abroad and they don't have the infrastructures in place, or no family has all immigrated or gone abroad or moved to different parts of the world, they need someone who can basically take care of them. And despite the fact that these could be, you know, wealthy petitioners or sponsors, they're really concerned because if this rule came into effect, they didn't speak English. Many of them have health problems or health conditions that may need treatment. And so they were the ones that really had kind of dragged their feet for a long time and wanted to do whatever they could to bring their parents. So we're talking about the elderly. It's going to have a negative impact on the elderly. It's also going to have an impact on those vulnerable immigrant populations that are in need of assistance. So we've had to have conversations with clients that have cancer, that have you know, significant types of diseases, HIV, etc., and they've had to make a choice. Do they pursue their green card being otherwise eligible, or do they continue their treatment utilizing, you know, some form of assistance? And so those are the kinds of individuals, individuals who aren't fluent in English, who are maybe elderly, they're above 61 years of age, but they're working in our hotels, in our agricultural fields, etc. They are going to be more likely than not found to be a public charge. Now, 3 federal injunctions went into place on October 11th, which is essentially halted temporarily this rule going into effect. However, the State Department, so that oversees all of our immigrant processes outside the United States, so through our embassies and consulates, has adopted that rule and has implemented that rule, and we've already begun to see visas denied on that basis. And so anyone applying for an immigrant visa, a green card, a non-immigrant visa could be impacted by this rule. We had a case, in fact, of an individual who had a job, was a working couple. They had children that were under 18 and they were over 61, and they basically were denied their visa because although they were working in Mexico, they could not demonstrate a job offer here. And they said, well, you can come back and you can reschedule once you have a job offer here. And they said, well, if we get there, then I'm sure I can find a job, you know, in my field, and I'll be able to get a job. It's kind of this catch-22. It's like, well, come back when you have a job offer. Well, I'll get a job offer if you give me my visa. And so it's creating just additional hurdles for people to overcome that previously just weren't in existence. We're also seeing really just the government enforcing our immigration laws, I think sometimes beyond the scope of their authority. So our removal cases, which means people who are being placed in deportation proceedings, are resulting from denied citizenship applications, not green card applications. The number of people that are being denied citizenship and having their green cards or attempting to have their green cards revoked and removed from the United States is incredible. And they're really looking at anything they can find in terms of fraud, misrepresentation. I had a single mother who had 4 U.S. citizen children. Her oldest served in the U.S. military. She was a victim of domestic violence, had a green card for a number of years, then suffered a stroke as a result of the work. We were able to overcome every other ground in terms of her English language requirement, passing the civics exam. We thought we were, 90% there. They ended up denying her citizenship and almost placing her in removal proceedings because they discovered that at some point in time she had applied for food stamps for her U.S. citizen children and failed to disclose income that she was receiving from recycling water bottles on her application. And so they felt that that was a misrepresentation, that she had committed fraud, because had she included that income, then perhaps they couldn't even prove that in fact her food stamp amount would be lessened, but that presumably it could have been affected. And so we had to get congressional offices involved to prevent that from happening, because her son was deployed at the time. I felt it was a very unfair, unjust outcome. But we're seeing more and more in terms of how these laws and rules are being interpreted, impacting people's ability to seek any immigration benefit. It's not just asylum, it's not just your green card, it's citizenship, it's across the board. And I think right now, if I could just share my last thought, that I'm seeing truthfully this week for the first time that is extremely concerning is typically when someone has a benefit denied, it could be their green card, it could be an application of some sort, and now the government knows that they're here unlawfully, so they will issue what's called a notice to appear. They'll have to go to court. This week, literally for the first time, we're seeing people apprehended and taken into custody rather than being issued notices to appear. It kind of was blowing my mind. I said, this can't be happening. Typically there's a process that's followed, giving people an opportunity to appear in court, to have their case heard, to seek, legal counsel. And we've had 3 cases alone this week here in Orange County, and solely in Orange County, where people have been apprehended after an application has been denied. And now we're left with trying to get them out on bond or to pursue their case. And the last thing I would say is they're moving people far away, and I know Professor Coe is going to talk about this, but I had spent so many hours trying to find what court had jurisdiction over this detention facility in Richwood, Louisiana. I called every immigration attorney in the state of Louisiana to help me figure this out, and I couldn't. It turns out it's the court in Batavia, New York, that has jurisdiction over this case. Nobody else knew that, was aware of that. There's a lot of things that are happening behind closed doors. They're not responding to phone calls, not the courts, not ICE. It's as an educated, competent, experienced immigration attorney. All I can say is that we are all living in very uncertain times, and we're not able to get the communication, the information that we need to be able to adequately represent the client. My client ended up going forward on the hearing. The court wouldn't return my call, has not made a decision on any of my motions, and I am really at a loss right now to figure out how else we can go about basically being effective advocates for the immigrants whose really due process rights are at stake. So thank you.
I think I'm next. Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Coe, and I think Lisa set things up nicely by she mentioned a couple of phrases. She mentioned clients that were apprehended and placed into custody, and then she described for us the situation of clients getting sent to Louisiana, not knowing where the court was, not being able to get answers. So I'm going to use that as a segue to share a couple of thoughts that fundamentally, I think what I fundamentally want to communicate to you is the violence that is taking place right now under the name of the United States immigration system. And I don't use that word violence in a melodramatic or sort of way. I really mean it quite literally. Let me back up a little bit. So for the past several years, the immigration field has seen so many changes. So things like the public charge rule or the Remain in Mexico policy, turning people back away from the border, those are just two of dozens and dozens of changes that have implicated a number of issues that, we could be here all day, we could talk about how race has come up in our conversations about immigration, how immigrants of all kinds have been criminalized and portrayed as criminals, and how the immigration conversation has led us to a point where using hatefulness in politics has become so politically profitable that it's just kind of spread like a cancer throughout a lot of our public discourse. That being said, even just keeping up with developments in this field has been a lot like drinking from a fire hydrant pretty much every day. But I am going to just sort of narrow us down into one area, which is immigration detention and the deportation process. A law professor colleague of mine has, in an attempt to simplify some of the way immigration status and the field is mapped out, is he's compared immigration statuses to a hotel to kind of demonstrate, like, look, it's not just that we're either citizens or non-citizens, but there are actually many different kinds of immigration statuses. Someone could have a green card, someone might have a temporary visa, someone might be living in the penthouse, which would be being a United States citizen, someone might have DACA, which is kind of akin to just sort of like being in a hotel lobby where the hotel owners know you're there, but they'll offer you, water and kind of not make you leave. But at the same time, he says, there's a dungeon in this immigration hotel. And so what we have right now is a system that is very much a dungeon, and it's a dungeon that is operated in the name of enforcing our civil immigration laws. So violating the immigration laws is not a crime. And the reality is that if the federal government thinks it can deport you, even if they turn out to be wrong, if they think they have a legal basis to deport you, they can also detain a person. And that detention takes place, again, under the auspices of a civil system. The person isn't charged with a crime. They get this funny-sounding document called an NTA. Because the person isn't charged with a crime, and because it's not a criminal system, all of these legal fictions start to set in. So the government says a whole bunch of things. They said, we're going to put you behind bars in an orange jumpsuit. We're going to handcuff you and shackle you. We're going to deprive you of the ability to see your family members, especially, we can even send you anywhere in the country as long as it's a place that's convenient for us. But because it's not a crime, you won't be provided with a lawyer. You won't be provided with things like, sort of a right against double jeopardy. So, even if you already served your time on, like recycling cardboard for which you were, charged with petty theft, then facing deportation again is not criminal. It's just a civil sanction. All of those ideas have been built up over time. They weren't just invented in the last couple of years. But those fundamental ideas, this idea that like deportation is not a crime, and so it therefore doesn't give rise to the kinds of normal legal rights that we would associate when things that are really important to you are at stake, they all kind of created this really like ripe land field for leaders who wanted to sort of blame all of the problems of America on what are essentially the most vulnerable in our population. All of those legal fictions made it very, very possible to do that. And so what happens in immigration detention, again, is that detention then really becomes a place of violence. One of the things that I, and also Lisa is on the board of directors of this organization, have done is we've created a group called the Orange County Justice Fund. And so we operate a bond fund. What that means is so that people some people, not everyone, some people who are in immigration detention eventually have a chance to go before a judge and say, look, judge, I'm not a danger to the community. I will show up to court. If you assign an amount of money that I can pay to get out, then I can be released. So some people have the chance. There are a whole bunch of people who don't even get a chance to go before a judge to ask that. That's because we have other laws that say just certain categories of people have to be incarcerated while the government is trying to deport them. But that amount of money, under the law, the minimum is $1,500. The national average is $8,000. It's not like criminal bail where you can just kind of pay 10% of the money. The entire amount of the money needs to be posted all at once in a single check. And so what our organization does is we fundraise and we pay bonds so that people can be released. And that, in addition to cases where I've represented people, have really convinced me that the things that happen in detention and in the name of apprehending someone to enforce the immigration laws are violent. They include things like placing people in solitary confinement and in isolation to the point that they become suicidal, detaining people who have diagnosed mental health conditions, where the place they really should be is with their family and with their loved ones who can treat them, but instead, again, they're placed in chains and in cages and in places that are places of incarceration. We recently bonded out a mother from Costa Mesa who's a mother of 3 children. ICE claimed that she had missed her appointment to check in and wanted her to wear an ankle monitor, and when she said, no, I didn't miss an appointment, they said, you're being so difficult, we're just gonna take you in. All she could think about at the time was the fact that she was gonna be late picking up her children from school. And so she was telling us her story. She told of how she was thrown into the back of a truck like a piece of trash, how she asked to be at least strapped into the truck, ended up vomiting on herself. She was covered in vomit by the time she got to the detention center. When she got to the detention center, an ICE officer actually said, we don't actually think you need to go to court. You can be released if you post $3,000 of bond. So she approached our organization, we tried to post bond, and then we're told that the bond had been taken away because she had asked questions about documents that they were asking her to sign. So they decided she was being too difficult, and then she had to go before a judge. She's finally been since reunited with her children, but shared with us that her youngest has never been the same since that. I've seen clients who have nearly died in ICE detention because of their medical conditions, and increasingly when we receive bond requests, what we hear from people's advocates is something along the lines of, we are worried for this person's safety, and we are worried about every day that goes by while they're in detention. So again, there's a violence that occurs in the name of our immigration system. And I think many people will say, well, what about the rule of law, right? Didn't they break some kind of law? Isn't there some kind of law that needs to be enforced? And so I'll leave that further for Q&A, but I will say, to that question, I would ask to be shown a person who has broken no law before. And I ask that question really intentionally to invoke the story of when Jesus intervened on behalf of the woman who was accused of adultery, because that was the very question, right, that he had asked. And so for those of us who do put our faith in the cross, I think we know that the value of the cross comes from the fact that none of us can be in a place where we can say that we have broken no law, and we have only received just an outpouring of grace and forgiveness and redemption, and that we see that in our Lord and in our Savior, Jesus Christ. So thank you.
It's tough following all of you guys. I wanted to thank Alma also. I was, before thinking about coming here tonight, I knew Alma was going to be speaking, and thinking, what more can any of us really say? So I just want to thank you again for your sharing and your bravery in sharing that. So I'm Dee Dee. I work currently at Catholic Charities, Orange County, as the Director of Immigration Services. I'm not an attorney like the three ladies who've just shared. I'm actually a licensed clinical social worker. So in my role at Catholic Charities, I'm not necessarily in that role as a licensed clinical social worker, but I still, since 2009, and I currently do other work outside of Catholic Charities. I kind of picking up on some of the things Jennifer was just talking about. I do psychological evaluations for people in removal proceedings, and this can be people coming from other countries who have been very traumatized because of what they've experienced in their country. I'm part of what I'm here to talk about tonight is trauma in these times and in related to immigrant communities, but that's a really big topic. A lot of people who come here as immigrants come because of trauma they've experienced in their country, persecution from their governments, other kinds of violence that is not, where they don't have protection in their own countries. So a lot of what I've done over the last 10 years is document these people's stories in support of their petitions for asylum. If they're trying to gain entry in this country, to try to document symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, other anxiety disorders. But there's a large segment of folks, I'd say in the last 5 years that I've worked with, probably about 85% of them are people who've been in this country for a long time and find themselves in removal proceedings. They maybe had a green card at one time, or had DACA, or had come as a refugee, or were never documented, and find themselves in proceedings because they have broken a law, but they are afforded or allowed an attorney because they've been detected by the court as having some kind of major mental illness or a developmental disability. So in most cases, the reason why they've been arrested maybe once or twice or multiple times is usually related to their mental illness or their disability. So I work with a lot of folks with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or even PTSD, developmental disabilities, so maybe what used to be known as mental retardations, now intellectual disability. So these are folks that are, so they've a lot of times having a major mental illness goes hand in hand with substance abuse or with being homeless and needing to, steal something or getting arrested for minor things that happen to people when they're homeless. So the trauma of, it's difficult enough living with a major mental illness and having schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, being on the street and then to find yourself in deportation proceedings and then to be deported. I've seen many, many cases of people who severely ill. They're just people who are very severely mentally ill, don't even realize they're very, don't even, not connected with reality, yet they can just be deported. It's very, it's hard to understand how that can be okay, in our country, okay for our country to do that. So I've had a number of cases of people, with schizophrenia, people with intellectual disabilities be deported. I also recently did an evaluation with a young boy who is a U.S. citizen. His mom is a U.S. citizen, so his siblings are citizens. His dad is in removal proceedings, and he's got some developmental, some undiagnosed issues going on that he's been struggling with for years. So now then his dad ends up in proceedings, and so he's reacting very, very poorly. He's acting out even more. So when we talk about the statistics, like it has been said, I want to kind of highlight again, there's a lot of trauma and struggle and pain that is heightened now. It's been, as a number of people have said, these problems with our immigration system have been around for a long time, but it does seem definitely heightened in the last few years. At Catholic Charities as well, just in the last few years, just kind of shift gears to the work that happens at Catholic Charities. We're working, part of our mission is to work with the low-income people. So a lot of times we're the only resource, the only resource for people to get their immigration matters taken care of. So the issue of public charge it's traumatizing the community. It's traumatizing us as well. People who are entitled to benefits, Medi-Cal, or food stamps, if they're legal permanent residents and they want to apply for citizenship, there's so much mixed information out there that they're disenrolling themselves. So thinking of going off of Medi-Cal even when they have serious medical illnesses and they're not in jeopardy of not getting their citizenship or getting deported. There's just so much fear and misinformation out there. So it's increasing the stress level on folks who are not yet citizens, who are in different immigration statuses, and it puts an added stress on the people who are trying to provide the services as well. It's a big topic. I could go on, but I'll turn the mic over.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thanks everyone here for your patience. Thank you, Greg, for the invite, and Alma. That was great. I was impressed that I come with these pens and notebooks, and you do everything from the phone, which is an impressive thing to do for someone like me. That's impressive. I'm Doug Ryan. I work with Catholic Relief Services. We represent the Catholic community in social and economic development overseas. We do a lot of work responding to emergencies. That's how most people know about us. But we're also, as someone noted, in the trenches in a lot of these issues. I'd like to start maybe from the top and say that while we're probably not managing the border issues that well, the solution to this issue is really in the Northern Triangle countries themselves, in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Our premise in working in those countries is that everyone has the right to remain. We kind of turn in some ways, the immigration argument on its head and say, what are we doing to allow people to stay in the place that they were born and where their ancestors are buried? A lot of our work is around creating the potential or the conditions for people to really realize their full human potential. That is not happening with as much success as we would like, as we can see, and we're very cognizant of that. I wanted to say that I think in this debate, a lot of the people succumb, I think, to an easy path of analysis, and a lot of it is just looking for someone to blame on all of this. Blaming the U.S. government, for example, and you can go back and look at our bends in 1956 in Guatemala and start there, and you would have a really good argument. You could talk about it from the Cold War perspective and say that, well, it was necessary to essentially crush social justice movements in Central America in the 80s and 90s in the name of defeating the Soviet Empire. You can have endless discussions about this. It doesn't get us to the solutions that we need to this crisis. You can blame administrations. Every administration, as I think Greg mentioned, has allowed this issue to drift. So there's a bit of a pox on all the houses. Some people blame the triangle governments. I hear people say without any evidence that these are corrupt governments or these are incompetent governments. I worked in these countries for about 15 years and worked with government people who were incredibly competent and incredibly smart and incredibly capable. We need to empower them. We need to give them the leverage to solve some of the problems that they're experiencing in their countries. People will blame the gangs, and the gangs do atrocious things. There's no way to get around that, and they are the root of a lot of the violence in these countries. There's a lot of unpacking to do with that issue as well. There's another side to that, without necessarily forgiving some of the more heinous acts. What I find most interesting about the debate is people who blame the migrants themselves, or blame DACA folks. I was listening to someone on the radio coming up here talking about that. This idea that we can demonize, that we can make the other, that we can use words that denigrate and dehumanize people, I find disgusting. I find it also doesn't get us to any kind of solution. I would offer that maybe what we ought to be doing as a church is looking at this issue through a lens of solidarity and through a lens of subsidiarity. Why would I say solidarity? Well, partly because we're one human family, but partly because some of these issues really transcend politics and they transcend U.S. policy. Climate change is something we've got to get our heads around as a world community. In this particular part of the world that we're talking about, but in many other places. Things like trade and globalization are things that we've got to get a better grip on. And there are a lot of sides to the trade policy issues, but those are the kinds of things that collectively we've got to think through a lot better, because they're somewhat at the root of what we're talking about. I would say when someone says, well, what are the root causes, I think if we asked you all to write them down, you'd get it right. I mean, everyone knows it's poverty. And poverty is rooted in an inability really to invest in human capital, to have the resources to invest in people, and create, again, those conditions for human potential. The roots of it are in violence. They're in a lot of it is the gang violence. A lot of it is the cartels between the elites who are in the government and the wealthy of these countries and the very poor, which is the vast majority. There's this big gap, and there's the gangs and the cartels have driven a truck right through it, and they've planted themselves there. And they are essentially civil society in a lot of in these three countries. Civil society exists. I don't want to say that they don't, but they need to be empowered. Climate change is probably the third of the big three root causes. We work with farmers all over Central America and all over the world. I don't even have to talk about the climate debate with anyone. We just know what we do with the people that we work with. Coffee farmers who started planting here and now they're planting up in that top row because they've got to get to a higher climate where it's shady or where temperatures are cool. A lot of these folks are refugees, are climate refugees, and we've got to kind of get our heads around that. Finally, I would say you can kind of do an inventory and take what I would call kind of an appreciative inquiry approach to all this and look at what's being done. The governments in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, including Nicaragua and Costa Rica, have come up with something called Alliance for Progress. Some of you are old enough to say, well, didn't we have that? Well, yes, we did under the Kennedy administration, but this is a plan that the Central American governments themselves have put together, and they've outlined the whole problem. They know exactly what needs to be done. What they don't have is the leverage over it. They're not empowered to do it. They don't have the resources to do it. That's something that we can help on. That's something we can talk to our representatives and senators about and say, these are the kinds of things that are needed. Catholic Relief Services works with gangs all over Central America. We take someone who's a gang member, and let me just say this before going into that. When we talk to gang members and said, what is your highest aspiration? And you would think, everyone thinks that what people say is they want to go to the US, that they want to get out of the country that they're in. It's not that at all. They are talking about things that are as normal as, things that we would want. They talk about education. They talk about having a way out. We work with those gangs. We give them a deal. We can help them continue their education. We can stake them up in a business if they got a good idea, and we can get them a job in the formal sector. About 80% of the economies in Central America are what is called the informal sector. You see it all the time if you're in the countries. Getting people into formal sector jobs. We've moved about 20,000 people at this point into that system, and the fact that they've stayed for 3 years means that that is a success. One of our staff people in El Salvador, Rosa Anaya, was just given an award last night at Georgetown University for peace building in El Salvador. She has spearheaded a program called Second Chance. She goes into the prisons, right? This is a whole another level. Works with gang members who have been in prison to get them out and get them mainstreamed and get them jobs in this case in El Salvador. We do a lot of work around agriculture, around climate smart agriculture, helping people to increase the yields with productive soils, much of which is damaged for reasons beyond their control due to climate. Rapid scale up of water systems, heavy investment in education. There have been some things with the current administration that aren't so great. One of them is the threat and the carrying through the threat of withholding development aid to Central America. Either you stop people coming or we're not going to give you money. Well, it's a very crude and very crass way of going about it. We have always used development assistance as a diplomatic tool. And it's always been one of the most successful things that we do. We have had some projects that have been defunded as a result of this. If you want to help farmers to stay where they are, you can't take away the funding when they're trying to make that adjustment due to climate change. So we need to be very active on the advocacy front. I'm probably going over time. I have probably one more thing to say, and that's about civil society. That's really going to save the day, I think, in many of these countries. A lot of this is around governance, but a lot of it is about holding governments accountable to their people so that they can create those conditions I'm talking about for human potential. So we're on the ground every day working on these things. I think that's where a lot of the focus can be and should be, and thank you for listening and for supporting any of the work that we do at CRS. Thank you.
Just explain the law or what happened, Jennifer, why don't you start and then I'll add something in a number.
So family separation has always been a part of immigration law, but it obviously came to a head in a much more stark and dramatic way in recent years. I think it was just last summer where you saw, right, the images and thousands of children just taken away from their parents, really as a deterrent strategy. The idea was, this has sort of been policy, right? Let's be as cruel as we can, and let's intentionally impose the highest level of human suffering possible to stop this thing from happening. And the problem is that the push factors and the driving forces are also so extreme that it really just results in more suffering for various people without necessarily addressing the purported problem. There was a lot of public outcry. The administration claimed that they would stop the policy. They actually didn't. So we had a situation where the government said that they weren't doing a thing, but they were actually still doing it. And in the meantime, in the litigation over the family separation policy, it was also very clear that the practice itself was so haphazard and so poorly managed that proper records were not kept. And so still very high numbers of children have not yet been reunited with their parents as a result. So we still have sort of lasting fallout as a result. Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that like our future generations are gonna look back and say, you know, how could we do that? And by the way, what did you do when that happened?
And then I was just going to put a face to the number. I represented a separated mother. She was from Honduras, came in, her and her 5-year-old daughter were fleeing violence. They were arrested. She was told in the facility in Port Isabel Detention Center that the mother would have a hearing. She was under the impression that her daughter was being taken to a separate part of the facility just for the afternoon to be watched while she went to a hearing. They took her 5-year-old daughter away from her. She had slept every night of her 5-year-old daughter's life with her 5-year-old daughter because she had been born sickly. So she was separated, and her 5-year-old daughter was never told what happened. She was placed with her older brother, but that's sort of the face with the name, and that happened to hundreds and hundreds of people. So the people weren't explained, the parents weren't explained what was happening, and the children weren't. And I'm always struck by this whole issue of the other, because imagine if it was your children or my children, and they're taken away, and close your eyes for a couple minutes and see the trauma that the children suffer. So I just wanted to put the face to the name, and I'm going to thank Alan for that all the time.
On the question of trauma, and sorry, I think because your time was running out, you stopped a little early, but the story of the mother you mentioned whose child wasn't the same after that, as I recall, it wasn't the same because they would ask every day, are you going to have to go to immigration today?
Yeah.
Right? I did watch the video, yes. And it's, I mean, it's incredible to think, you know, and lest we move past those stories too quickly just to sit in that, imagine a child just having that in their mind every day of potential separation again and reliving that over and over again, and then the impact on the parent. And I just, yeah, to your point, it's hard to think about that for our own kids. And this is a question related to date. How many children have been separated from their parents at the border, and how many remain separated?
I think it's 5,400, and I think there is a couple hundred that remains. I think there was 350 or 400 that remain separated.
I mean, it's a high number. I think that's right. It's in the thousands. At some point,
Yeah,
it's
really,
like,
yeah.
I mean, but even if it were like 20,
Right.
I mean, I guess there's the intentionality of it is really, I think, worth, I think it's going to take us some time. And I hope it's a conversation that our country is able to have. I mean, historically as a country, we've been very bad at talking about our collective mistakes, like sea slavery as the big example that we're only just now starting to really confront in any kind of meaningful way. Maybe if we go to Montgomery to visit, but I do hope it's a conversation that we can really fully take on with our children and grandchildren.
And it was a question which was a policy which had an intentionality behind it, and in fact had a biblical rationale at one point given for it in terms of, you know, the law of the land. It's I mean this is the level of work behind that is pretty remarkable. Actually, Bishop Van wrote a column about that as well. But
just a quick thing. The first person processed over the threshold at Ellis Island was an unaccompanied minor, as a 15-year-old girl from Ireland. So we've kind of handled this before in different. Yeah.
This is a question for you, Anna, about how many attorneys are helping at the Clinic Juarez project.
That's a great question, and I forgot to tell you that. I have such a long list of things, I forget some. So we only have one staff person, an attorney, we have one accredited rep, and we have a volunteer coordinator. Highest is in the state, in the process of sending an attorney, 1 or 2 attorneys down there. We've had 30 volunteers since we started in August. We are in the process of creating a more robust volunteer program. Attorneys and accredited reps and volunteers are nervous about going to Juarez, so it's not an easy volunteer opportunity. So imagine, we only have 3 people on the ground, and there's 15,000 people that are waiting there to seek protection in the United States.
And this is related, so I'll just continue on that front. On the Mexican side of the border and further south, there are thousands of people suffering because of the Remain in Mexico policy. How is the Catholic Church providing services to these people, and what can we do?
So, and Greg, you might have some of this information, maybe folks at the panel. So there's issues about shelter in Juarez. There's not enough shelter for all of the people that are there. So people are living in the streets in insecure locations. And there's an organization called the Annunciation House, which is in El Paso. And before, things shift so quickly. So earlier this year, when the Remain in Mexico program had not been fully implemented, there were literally 800 to 1,000 people a day that were approached the border, were admitted, and ICE was working with the local shelters in El Paso to distribute them to the shelters, right, for initial accommodation, and then they would go en route to their family members throughout the United States. There are no releases now inside El Paso, so the Annunciation House and the other shelters do not have folks staying with them. So the Annunciation House, which is a Catholic organization, has now identified houses and small facilities in Juarez to house people, and they are housing the most vulnerable, generally women that have been assaulted in other facilities or on the street. Some of the shelters in Juarez, for example, there's one shelter we've just discovered within this past 2 weeks that is essentially practices indentured servitude. So the people there are controlled in terms of when they can leave and come, they're required to work, they're required to pay services, and again, these are poor people. So there's very little humanitarian assistance in Mexico, and our government says that Mexico is a safe place for them to live.
And there's just a great deal of predatory activity happening there. And so I can't speak to Juarez, but we did when we were in Tijuana. And we met with the consulates of El Salvador and Guatemala there, and they're working with the various albergues, the different shelters. Caritas in Mexico is doing sort of work of providing clothing and some assistance. And the different churches down there are working with certain shelters that they have relationships with. But the city of Tijuana really had very little requirements for anybody to open a shelter. So you don't know who's opening some of these shelters. Many of them were being placed in the red light district, and so there was like a pipeline for trafficking and other kinds of predatory. So it's a really, really scary situation for people who are already incredibly vulnerable, and then are now in once again being taken advantage of. We have another question. Is the church advocating for certain processes to expedite legal immigration?
Well, it's difficult now. Several years ago, the church had groups across the country, including lots of Catholic and religious organizations, came together to plan in the hopes of comprehensive immigration reform. There's very little hope at this time for comprehensive immigration reform. So there's no, that I know of, Greg, but you might, there's no organized national efforts that focus on that. Frankly, it's sort of responding to, it's rapid response to emergencies now and shifting changes.
Yeah, and do you have a comment on that? Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I completely get the intention behind the question, but we do certainly still have like Justice for Immigrants and advocacy wings in the church working for comprehensive immigration reform and more substantial changes in the law. But as was mentioned, at this point, we're just trying to keep up with the crisis needs and the emergency response. And as polarized as the issue has become, what was once more hopeful activities around like comprehensive immigration reform are pretty seem like pretty distant right now. I mean, that's still where we hope to go in many of these areas. There's a question here, how long does it take to get a work permit since from the time the person files an application?
It depends on the application. So if we're talking about like an asylum seeker, there's a very complex rule of from the date of filing, they have to wait 150 days before they can actually apply for work authorization. But one of the things, there's so many things that we could talk about that wasn't even mentioned, but we've represented several clients pro bono that are asylum seekers, and they're issued fake dates. So they're told to go to court, but the court has no filing because the government hasn't done their job. But then any agency, ICE, USCIS, can issue these NTAs that Jennifer referred to, these notices to appear. And so it's literally a circus. So they end up going to these fake date hearings, and the courts know nothing about them because nothing's been filed. So it delays their ability to file their asylum claim. We have clients that have been waiting over 2 years now to just simply get their application filed. USCIS won't accept it because they say the court has jurisdiction, the court has no file for them because the government hasn't filed anything. In the meanwhile, the person's being sent to various courts to have their hearing heard. Now, if you're applying for a green card, there used to be a rule that from the time of filing, the government had to produce your work authorization in 90 days. That rule was done away with. It's averaging, I would say, about 6 to 8 months sometimes. For those work authorizations to come out. But not everyone can qualify for work authorization for a work permit. So it really depends on what basis they're applying.
And this is a question that was directed to you, Lisa. Have you in your practice seen many or any NTAs for clients who applied for a U visa or T visa and their petition was denied? Mm-hmm. And how about detentions?
Yes, to all of the above. All of the above, yeah. And before, again, we can say before and after all night long. Before, it used to be when people applied for a U visa, which is a specific visa for victims of violent crimes that cooperated with law enforcement. The whole reason the U visa was created was to create a mechanism for law enforcement to get cooperation from immigrant communities because they weren't reporting crime. They weren't cooperating with law enforcement to the same extent and degree that they wanted them to. So if they cooperate with law enforcement in reporting or investigating crime, they can qualify for a U visa. The T visa is for trafficking victims. Beforehand, if you apply for one of those applications and your case was denied, all of those applications were handled in one office and basically end of story. It didn't go beyond that. Now it is a risk. You can't file a weak case. And again, like I mentioned, across the board, the government is looking for any reason to deny any type of benefit. So the risk is very high. Should a U visa or T visa applicant have their case denied, they're in the same boat as anybody else having contact with ICE or having another application denied, that they could be subject to apprehension and detention. So.
Another question, if a green card holder is on Medi-Cal and already applied for citizenship, is he or she affected by the public charge rule? I'll just do one at a time.
Yeah. No, it does not apply for citizenship. So this is strictly for people who do not have green cards. The only permanent residents that could be impacted by the public charge rule are legal permanent residents that have been absent from the United States for 180 days or more, and they're seeking to come back. And they may have criminal convictions or something that then causes them to be evaluated for admission purposes. They could be subject to the public charge rule. But in terms of the general lawful permanent resident applying for citizenship, the public rule does not apply, and that's really important. We had so many people, I mean, literally, that didn't need to pull their kids off of, Medi-Cal and food stamps and all this stuff. It's like, well, no, you need to put food on the table. That doesn't apply to you. But I think out of fear, and part of the intention behind the public charge rule was really just that, is to create a tremendous amount of fear.
I know since these were even hinted at becoming proposals before they were even proposals, Catholic Charities started seeing a drop in their applications for CalFresh. Well, even for CalFresh and other services, right?
Yeah, definitely throughout the state. I'm probably throughout the country, but I know definitely throughout the state. And so there was a decline in use of CalFresh or Medi-Cal, and then some of the foundations stepped in, like California Endowment. We had some funding through them to do then the counter education to the misinformation. So kind of we're just reacting to each crisis. There's a change in policy that terrifies people, and then we have to go and try to re-educate people and, okay, this applies to you, it doesn't apply to you, you know. But then they still don't believe us, and they're still scared, so.
And part of the reason our bishops and as a church we're so concerned about understanding this issue well is that the church is a trusted voice in many different areas, and we want to have the best information about this so that when we're asked questions, the church can respond and that we can cut through some of the misinformation so that there are plenty of legitimate fears to have. We don't need to have like unfounded fears on top of all those. So how to really help have the very best information available to our community. How is an immigrant petition already in the system affected by this rule regarding the obtaining of insurance before being approved?
So it depends on what you mean by petition. So if someone strictly has a petition and not an application for permanent residency, it will depend on once the injunction's lifted or when the rule goes into effect, if they have filed their application for permanent residency before or after that rule. So it's not retroactive, meaning if there's any pending application for a green card, for other types of, I guess, legal statuses, non-immigrant worker visas, things of that nature, it does not impact those. And it's still not impacting the cases that are filed today, tomorrow, until a change happens with the court, the process. So, yeah.
Another question is, when someone gets detained by ICE, where can a family start looking for them inside the U.S. and outside the U.S.?
I mean, so there, during the Obama administration, there was this ICE detainee locator system that was created. So it is still online. You can put in a person's A number and it should tell you, in theory, where the person is. I think where people are starting to hear more and more reports of it becoming increasingly very difficult to find people. So if the person doesn't show up on that detainee locator system, it really starts to become like a matter of calling facilities one by one by one, and kind of going on a wild goose chase for them or waiting for them to call or to write. There's not a free phone call. So it's a problem.
And that is one of the things that the Orange County Justice Fund is seeking to do, is to coordinate, at least for those from Orange County, is to figure out where everyone is detained at some level and to sort of figure out how to coordinate potential.
Well, we are coordinating access to counsel for Orange County residents who are detained at the Adelanto facility, which is the largest ICE detention facility in Southern California. It's a for-profit prison owned by the Geo Corp.
And our delegation of bishops from California went to do a pastoral visit there last summer. And it was just, I went with Bishop Wynn, was one of our bishops who was there. And we have folks in the San Bernardino Diocese who are there consistently, friends of detainees here from Orange County that I know DD and others have worked with. And it's just, again, speaking to the violence and the separation and the trauma that's there, it's remarkable.
Greg, if I could just say one thing, because I think for me, really what's burdening my heart, for the lack of a better way of articulating it, is not just the detention of immigrants. We've seen the detention of immigrants for many, many decades. I think to Jennifer's point, it's the violence. It's the stories of the abuse by the officers, and I'm not saying that they're ICE officers. They could be ICE officers. They could be these private facility officers, really abusing, making people stand in cells naked, physically abusive, laughing at them, dehumanizing them, just mistreating them. And so the client that I mentioned that's in Richwood, Louisiana, this is relatively new. Louisiana has now, I believe, 7 or 8 detention facilities. That seems to be the direction where all of these immigrants are being kept. And the hardest part is that it is in the middle of nowhere. There's no access to legal representation, resources, etc. And my client that's housed there right now is a Cuban asylum seeker. His wife, who also entered with them, was released on bond, and his mom is a lawful permanent resident. He has aunts and cousins and uncles who are U.S. citizens. His wife has nobody, And his parole has been denied now 3 times, and he's been denied bond. The judge does not have jurisdiction to even consider releasing him on bond. So I think it was last week, or maybe it had to be 2 weeks ago, I read in the newspaper, someone said article that there was a Cuban asylum seeker at this facility that was found dead. And I panicked because I thought initially it was my client. And I was like waiting to find out from the family if it was him or not. I don't know how many Cuban asylum seekers are at this facility. It turned out, obviously, it was not him. But I think the thing that really just hurts my heart, as a US citizen taxpayer, that our dollars are being used that 9 children have, I believe to date, have died in ISIS custody this year alone. When I hear of those stories, when I hear the stories of our clients sharing about their treatment, I know the client that Jennifer spoke of that being kind of tossed like trash in the back of a car. She had no seatbelt, and so severe concussions on her head and they were laughing. And so the fact that that type of behavior is being done with our tax dollars in our name, I told it, and maybe it sounds dramatic, but I almost feel like blood on my hands, so I never feel like I'm doing enough, because there's so much to be done. But it's disheartening, I think, just the dehumanization of these immigrants in custody and the treatment that they're enduring. And we had one bond recipient who spoke at our event last week who suffered atrocious violence and abuse in his home country. And he says, well, everything I suffered in El Salvador does not even compare to what I suffered in ICE custody. And when I heard that, I was like dumbfounded. I was like, because I've heard the stories of the violence and the trauma that they're coming from, and to say that it's what they suffered in ICE custody is worse, there's a serious problem for me as a citizen, voter, taxpayer. So just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, and I do want to mention, because I don't want to forget it later, is for us to be praying for lawyers and agency workers and folks who work. I know they're not here to ask for sympathy, or they would be loath to have anybody draw attention to themselves, but there's also trauma that comes from day in, day out, being in the trenches, working on these issues and seeing the punishing effects of these policies and trying to help people day after day. So that's not why they're here, is to ask for that, but I would ask that you would keep them in your prayers and folks like them who are doing this work. We have another question. I'm trying to get through the rest of these before our time is up tonight. Is there going to be a citizenship question on the census application or not? And I'm going to take this one because I'm on our Diocesan Census Committee. There is not going to be a question on this citizenship on the census, but the arguments about it and the attempt to get it on there has already happened, and so there is already now a looming issue around that being in the air. So a lot of people think there still is going to be one. A lot of people, even if they don't know, that it just causes more and more distrust in the process of census. So we do have a diocesan committee on the census working with our parishes to get out the word, to encourage people to participate in the census, to know that that information is confidential, to help make sure people fill it out ahead of time, online and over the phone and on calls, working with OCO, working with some other community organizations and local census folks. Because if you do all that ahead of time, then you don't have to have an enumerator come to your door or come into your apartment complex or in your community. So we want to help everybody to do that ahead of time. And our bishops have been very adamant that every person counts. That's true as a very fundamental concept, but when we talk about the census, everybody needs to count. And census dollars affect everything from our 911 response calls to the resources in our communities to our schools and everything. So we really want to make sure that everybody participates, and we're going to be working to do that. Ciudad Juarez is a very violent city and home to the Juarez cartel. How or why was this city chosen to house the asylum seekers, and how do you change the city, or how can you?
That's a good question. Well, it's not confined to Ciudad Juarez. The Remain in Mexico program applies all along the southern border. So from California all the way across. So it's applied everywhere, and the varying degrees of dangerousness in each of the cities. Matamoros is particularly bad as well, Nuevo Laredo. So, I mean, I think you solve this by, I mean, Mexico doesn't have the capacity or the ability to provide humanitarian assistance. There's Mexican asylum seekers waiting in Mexico. It's dangerous for them. You solve for this by applying U.S. law, international law. You process people, you admit them, you ensure conditions that they'll report for their hearings. And the best thing to ensure compliance with court attendance, etc., is legal counsel. And that's the solution. It's as simple as that.
So this next question says, the last time something like this happened was in the 1930s. I think of one of the mistakes made, the questioner says, was the American Jewish or Japanese communities made was in keeping quiet and not making political waves. This was made worse by mainstream religious communities encouraging the deference to the authority. What outreach is being made to the lawful family members to organize? There's a lot to kind of unpack in that, but response to the question of how...
I just have one quick question. I think we should use the civil rights leaders as our models. So then I'll list the rest of the panel. So they're our models. Be brave. Laws aren't just. Sometimes we have to break the laws to change in terms of protesting, etc. So that's how I'd say.
Yeah, I think it's going to take a pretty serious movement. I was personally impressed by the pre-DACA young people that took on that issue alone. I mean, they went to DC and they made an issue. I think the first step before we can even begin to organize is to expose and bring awareness. I think there's just so much happening in secret that even someone like me, who this is my job, this is what I do day in and day out, I'm surprised almost on a daily basis of what I learn about conditions, disappearance of teenagers. I mean, and journalists. I mean, there's some of them are so brave and courageous to do these Freedom of Information Act requests, to try to get the information. Where are these facilities? How are they moving people? Where are the children going? You know, and so I really feel there has to be an effort of research, information sharing, awareness, publicity brought to the injustice, and then I think it's going to be the organization. But I think what makes this so different than perhaps, you know, historical internment camps and things of that nature is that it's just so hidden in private facilities. There's no transparency, there's no accountability. It doesn't involve public officials, elected officials, etc. But I think you're right. I think it's going to take, you know, a real kind of civil rights effort to make it.
I mean, although, and I completely agree, but the organizing is happening, it's underway. There is a movement. There's a movement right here in Orange County, right? It was Orange County and actually Los Angeles-based Dreamers who fought for DACA, and they really fought. It wasn't like through polite conversation and persuasive argument that they fought for DACA. So I think that movement is out there. It's just a matter of the rest of us coming along and hearing what folks on the ground have to say about what the lived experience is, right? To live with ICE in your neighborhood and to live with that threat and to live with the fear. It's there, and you know, solidarity and support is necessary, and votes matter.
Thank you for that. And it's important to remember that Orange County is in many ways kind of ground zero. I mean, the Minutemen the anti-immigrant group was formed here in Orange County. FAIR, many of these like highly funded groups that are very pushing back in the other direction. I mean, they grew up out of this area, and I think you know, it's something to remember that this is and that as Professor Coe mentioned, these are battles that are already going on, and I think part of the challenge to the church is how are we going to get involved, and how are we going to step up and enter into these things more deeply. This is the last card, and I think it'll maybe give a chance for each of you to respond fairly quickly. I'm sorry we don't have too much more time, but as lawyers, and I'll just expand it to everyone here, what do you wish people knew about what's going on here, and about your role? And I know this is like a really broad thing, but if you have a little something that you might want to mention about how your faith impacts the way that you come at this question about how we address your faith tradition or your own spirituality, your own background. How do you come at that question? So what do you wish people knew? There was one more thing to talk about that. So I'm just going to leave it at that just for closing comment here.
I guess the thing that comes to my mind is we're always amazed at how powerful your voice is with a local representative. You know, if you go into the local representative's office, CRS can go in there, and we've got, you know, we're kind of big-shouldered in the NGO community, but constituents talking to their elected officials about any of these issues, it's unbelievably powerful. And it doesn't take that many of them. It doesn't even take a movement in many ways. It takes just a number of people hammering on an issue. So I would urge everyone to, I guess if you didn't know that already, know that you have much more power than you probably think. And we've seen it time and again with on these issues.
So I guess I'm always a little, well, there's a lot of information out there. I do think there is a lot. It just takes a sort of a will to seek it out and to hear some of the stories that various organizations are working really hard to amplify. So I'll say that. And I shared earlier about my faith. I think the one thing I just might add is, you know, I do believe in evil and darkness. And I think my faith is part of that. And I see a darkness that is facilitated. I'm not saying that, you know, ICE is evil, but there is a darkness that festers and that is encouraged to fester in parts of our country as a result of certain systems that we have supported and allowed to build up. So, on that happy note.
I think as far as my faith, I think the scripture that comes to mind just right now is, you know, what you've done for the least of these, you've done unto me, is something that I live by. And I think in terms of what I would want you to do or know, I think Jennifer's right. There's a lot of organizations doing some really great work. I'm going to put a shameless plug for the Orange County Justice Fund. Look us up at ocjusticefund.org. Please contribute if you're so inclined. And what when I spoke of earlier, when I said I don't feel like I'm doing enough, and it was that moment, it was right before a fundraising event, and I just was real, oh my gosh, if I didn't have kids and I wasn't married, I would just go to Richwood and I would find a trailer or take a RV out there or something and try to see, because there's only 200. I'm like, I can handle 200, you know, like, so at least we can get like representation for like one facility just under control. And somebody had said, well, it's a good thing you're married, it's a good thing you have kids. And for me, it was like, because I didn't feel like I was doing enough, but then it was a good reminder, because that week was going into Orange County Justice Fund. I go, but yes, I am concentrating my skills, my education, my gifts in the area that I can, so that others can do that work, so we can bond people out, so we can coordinate legal representation. And if there's one thing that I could sell and just maybe plant the seed that can spread like wildfire, is this is a commitment, I know Professor Coe, myself, and all of the board of the Orange County Justice Fund, but is to make Orange County a place of universal representation, meaning that nobody, for lack of funds, faces immigration deportation proceedings without a lawyer. So how we make that happen, I think there's a lot of creativity in this room, but if that so sparks something in you and you've got some contribution that you want to make towards that end, that would be, I think, a big dream of ours for us to share, is to really, we can do it in Orange County, it's doable, I really believe that. And there's, you know, the city of Santa Ana has taken the lead in many respects, but I think if we all work together to accomplishing this finite goal here at home, it would hopefully spread and create a replicable model. So, yeah.
I think, you know, if there's something you want to do, to just do it. You know, every little bit does do something. You know, if it's voting or just getting involved in an organization, you want to get involved. But the worst thing any of us can do is to just shut down and not try to do something. You know, as it was just said, we have more power than we think we do. Orange County's come a long way. You know, I grew up here too. I know Susan, you know, both of us worked at Catholic Charities Group. We've seen a lot of change happen in Orange County, in a place I never expected the changes to happen politically in Orange County. I thought, man, it's never going to happen. But, just keeping at it, all of us keeping at it. And I think compassion is a word that I try to keep in my mind, it seems to cut across religions, and those people who will use religion to harm other people, demonize other people, kind of challenge them to define where does compassion fit in, not just in your religious values, but in all these struggle, in these political issues that really impact people's lives. It's about having compassion for the people who are going to be impacted by our political ideals or values or policies, whatever.
And then I would say that my faith is a huge part of this work and always has been, and I feel particularly powerful now to lead a Catholic organization, and I use that all the time to convince CBP officers to admit Mexicans for asylum proceedings, to talk to authorities to try to get my clients released. But I would say I am so moved every time I go to a detention center or I'm at the border with people that are living on the streets with so little, how they always bless me. I'm moved. And where they find God in places that I find almost impossible. So I'm moved by them, and I would leave just with something Pope Francis, my hero, said on World Refugee Day of 2018. Every stranger who knocks at our door is an opportunity for an encounter with Jesus Christ. And I believe that. So I would ask you not to look at our migrant brothers and sisters as others. They are us, and they are Jesus. So I just leave you with that.
Yeah, lest you think I'm not a person of faith. Because I did not answer that question, and I wasn't avoiding it. It just got past me somehow. I grew up Catholic, went to catechism, did all of that stuff. I was taught the faith, but it was nuns in Guatemala who taught me that there was this thing called the social gospel, and that it was something to be lived, and it was something that was part of your day-to-day life, and that's sort of where I come from on this stuff. It's really through action that we live out our faith, and I urge all of us to continue doing that. And I admire all the people on this panel who do it every day and take up the cross. So thank you for the
Thank
opportunity.
you. It's like textbook Catholic guilt. It's like, wait a minute. I didn't grow up Catholic, so I can say that. No.
You're not wrong.
Well, no, I'm glad we all got a chance to share. So I do want to just say, again, we could be here for days, unpacking these different things. They do this every day. But I hope that this has given a greater understanding around many of these areas, and I hope it's given you some things to take back. If we came tonight kind of wanting to know more, I hope it's given us more and given us more to feed our thinking about this topic. If we're kind of ready to figure out what we can do, I hope it's given us some things that we can share with other people, because you in this room are the ones who are going out and helping to dispel the misinformation and to share with other people why we need to be concerned about this and why it pertains to life and dignity of the human person. And so I want to just acknowledge that and thank all of you for all that you've shared with us tonight. And we're gonna close. Could we give them a round of applause? Remembering those who have died actually in custody of the government here, and to remember the names of people who have died, and not because they matter, and because they are sisters and brothers, and because we want to remember them, as well as remember all the people whose names we don't know, who have died and whose dignity have been threatened and torn down in various ways. So we're going to read a brief litany here, and at the end, when we say we proclaim, the response is presente. So can we all say that together? We proclaim presente.
For accompanied minor 16-year-old, Carlos Gregorio Hernandez Vasquez from Guatemala, who is seeking refuge with relatives in the U.S. We proclaim. For those children like 2.5-year-old Wilmer Jose Ramirez Vasquez, whose parents' only crime was seeking asylum from Guatemalan violence, we proclaim.
For those teenagers who needed to leave their home country to find a better life in the U.S. and help their family, as 16-year-old Juan de Leon Gutierrez from Guatemala, who died in El Paso needing medical care, we proclaim. For 7-year-old Jacqueline Caal Maquin from Guatemala, who could have lived a healthy life if she had had treatment of bacterial infections earlier in her journey, we proclaim.
For 8-year-old Felipe Alonso Gomez from Guatemala, who had hopes for living the American dream before he contracted a cough, nausea, and fever, we proclaim. So many children are looking for family and parents in the U.S. 10-year-old Darlene Cristabel Cordova Valle from El Salvador look forward to being reunited with their mother, yet heart illness made reunification unattainable. We proclaim. Another 20-month-old girl, Maria Juarez from Guatemala, died shortly after being held with her mother at a family detention center in Texas. We proclaim.
Lord, for all of these and for the many others for whom we do not have names, for DACA youth, for all those who are represented by interactions with the folks on our panel today, for those in our communities, for those struggling to find a way forward, and for all of us in this room as we seek to respond to your call upon our lives, to your Holy Spirit, to find those ways that we can respond, we proclaim. Presente. We ask all this in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I want to just again thank you for coming.